prior to the revolution, Russia's economy was going in reverse. In the second half of the 19th century, Russia's railroad system was a tenth of the size of Germany's and France's. Also, their society was still deeply rooted in a feudal system in which most Russians were peasants or serfs. Signs of the weak state were evident, especially following their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the toils of the First World War. Vladimir Lenin was an exiled Marxist revolutionary who believed that the situation in Russia was so bad that the country could not wait for the revolution to come about naturally. He differed from Marx, since he believed that vanguards of the revolution had to bring about the change as opposed to it happening naturally. Lenin argued for a concept called democratic centralism. This meant that only a small, secretive, hierarchical party of professional revolutionaries could hope to succeed. This allowed for discussion and debate within the group, but once a decision was made, everyone would obey it without question, and a unified message would be given to the people. Lenin's radical ideas led to a split within communism. These two factions became to be known as the Mensheviks, who were orthodox Marxists, and the Bolsheviks, who were Lenin's supporters. On November 7, 1917, Bolshevik troops overthrew the provisional government. In 1918, civil war broke out. Forces loyal to the Tsar and the provisional government tried to topple the Bolshevik regime. However, Lenin responded by reinforcing democratic centralism and creating Cheka, the first secret police force. In 1921, Lenin finally gained control and formally created the USSR. During Vladimir Lenin's reign during the former years of the 1920s, Russia was still not yet a totalitarian dictatorship. There were still open debates, civic worldly culture was still alive, and dissenting views were still allowed to be spoken. Additionally, stringent wartime economic measures were relaxed under the new economic policy, the NEP, which encouraged peasants, merchants, and industrialists to pursue private business. Lenin also created the Third International, or Comintern, to lead what he expected to be a worldwide communist revolution. Before he died in 1924, Lenin wrote the Political Testament in which he criticized the Bolshevik leadership. He singled out Trotsky and Stalin, warning that neither should be allowed to take over the party.
Unfortunately, Lenin's wishes did not come true. In the years following his death in 1928, Joseph Stalin rose to power. The quarter century that Stalin ruled the Soviet Union was one of the most painful periods in all of history, where as many as 20 million Soviet citizens lost their lives. One of Stalin's most prominent reforms was industrialization. He recognized that Russia was behind economically and forced his country to industrialize by adopting a two-pronged strategy. First, Stalin restructured rural life. Farmers were herded into gigantic, supposedly efficient state farms, and more than 90 million peasants were relocated to cities to work in factories. Those who resisted were killed on the spot or sent to forced labor camps, where most died. Second, the agricultural surplus and other resources were used to spark industrialization and modernization of the Soviet economy. Stalin created an ambitious 5-year plan that called for doubling production of coal, oil, pig iron, steel, electricity, and cloth between 1928 and 1932. The Central Planning Commission was created to set goals for the entire country, and individual ministries turned them into specific quotas for factories and farms. Although the plan fell short of its goals, the USSR industrialized rapidly. By the time Stalin had solidified his power, capitalist forces seemed to threaten the existence of the world's first socialist state. As a result, Stalin reversed Lenin's policy and called for socialism in one country. At first, Stalin prohibited communist parties elsewhere from participating in anti-fascist coalitions, including one that might have prevented the Nazis from taking power in Germany. However, by 1934, he reversed his policy again, signing the infamous Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany. In 1941, Germans invaded the USSR, at which point Moscow joined the Allies. After World War II ended, tensions between the USSR and the West escalated into the Cold War. Now let's talk about the purges. Initially, the party conducted a few purges to limit opportunists and those who joined in the aftermath of the revolution. But as Stalin's reign continued, the number of purges escalated. The purges drained the party of many of its enthusiastic members and qualified leaders, including in the secret police, many of whose own leaders found themselves on trial for their lives. By the end of the decade, 5 out of 9 Politburo members, 98 out of 139 Central Committee members, 1,108 of 1,966 delegates in the 1933 Party Congress, and half the Army Officer Corps had been killed. Larger prisons averaged about 70 executions per day, and people were given 5 to 8 year sentences for having a socially dangerous relative. Although there were horrible consequences for millions of people, by the time Stalin died, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's two superpowers.
After Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev eventually became the party secretary and premier of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. In 1956, Khrushchev called the delegates to the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, 20th Party Congress back for a special session. For 3 hours, he spoke his famous secret speech in which he denounced Stalin's rules and practices, particularly the purges he sponsored. After the speech, Khrushchev allowed censorship and other political controls to be loosened, decentralized economic decision-making, and initiated the revitalization of the agricultural sector. This process was called de-Stalinization. Khrushchev also sought to relax foreign tensions with the United States through a policy called peaceful coexistence. However, many of his colleagues believed that his reforms went too far in eroding central party control and Soviet prestige. Only few of his reforms worked by the early 1960s, and as a result of social and economic problems mounting, so did opposition to his rule. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 prepared his way out of power in the Soviet Union. To summarize this international fallout, the United States discovered that the Soviets were preparing to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. Then, U.S. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade to prevent the Soviet ships. As a result, the Soviet ships turned around and dismantled their bases. Khrushchev's diplomatic and military failure in the Cuban Missile Crisis ensured his removal from power. In 1964, Khrushchev was replaced by the much more conservative Leonid Brezhnev. Under Brezhnev, the reforms ended, and he tried to cope with the growing number of economic problems.
Gorbachev's timeline began in 1985 when Chernenko died. Later that year in March, Gorbachev took over as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In November, he attended a summit in Geneva between Gorbachev and U.S. President Ronald Reagan. This marked the beginning of improvement in relations between the two superpowers. In February of 1986, Gorbachev gave a speech at the 27th Party Congress, giving plans for economic restructuring, aka perestroika, and glasnost, which is the increasing of public discussion of issues and accessibility of information to the public. Overall, this means limits on private initiatives and more independence for enterprises. In April of 86, Chernobyl explosion occurred. This was the world's worst nuclear disaster. It was initially covered up by the Soviet authorities. Throughout 87, food and clothing shortages got worse through the years of perestroika. In January of 87, Demokratizatsiya was a slogan introduced by Gorbachev in January, calling for the infusion of democratic elements into the Soviet Union's single-party government. Gorbachev's democratization meant the introduction of multi-candidate, though not multi-party, elections for local Communist Party and Soviets. In this way, he hoped to rejuvenate the party with progressive personnel who would carry out his institutional and policy reforms. In October of 87, Gorbachev sacked Boris Yeltsin. In June of 88, there was a heated televised discussions at the party's 19th conference. The policy of glasnost, opening up transparency in the activities of government, freedom of information, etc., was officially adopted. In March of 89, the Soviet People's Congress elections were held. Yeltsin got elected and Gorbachev was out.
Yeltsin was born on February 1st, 1931. He was given the name Boris after a drunk priest left him in the water during his baptism. According to the priest, if he could withstand the cold water, Yeltsin was strong enough to handle anything life would throw at him. The story of his baptism is extremely ironic, because Yeltsin is known for his excessive drinking, a characteristic he seems to have in common with his priest. Yeltsin lived a fairly difficult life, being born into a working-class family that lived in communal situations, on a farm and later at a construction site. His family was in close contact with many other families, and their privacy was extremely limited. When Yeltsin grew up, he attended university to become an engineer, and started out in the construction industry. Under Nomenklatura, however, Yeltsin was able to climb the ranks to become a prominent politician. Nomenklatura, an ordered path from local party Soviets to the commanding heights of leadership, was how men became a part of the Politburo, the political center during the Soviet Union, created by Lenin in 1917. He served as a member of the Politburo until August 1991, when he served as the leader of the Revolution of 1991, in which protesters advocated for Gorbachev's removal from office. Following the revolution, Yeltsin was elected president of the powerful republic that was renamed the Russian Federation, putting an end to the old Soviet-style regime. In an attempt to improve the economy after his ascension to power, Yeltsin used shock therapy reforms, which called for economic liberalization through a free market economy. The drastic changes to the economy left many of the citizens of Russia to struggle financially. Under Yeltsin, the Constitution of 1993, which created a three-branch government, including the president and prime minister, a lower legislative house known as the Duma, and a constitutional court, was accepted. A national referendum was held on December 12, 1993, during which over half of the registered voters voted for the adoption of this constitution. Another important aspect of Yeltsin's political career was his handling of Chechnya. After the fall of the USSR in 1991, Chechnya, a primarily Muslim region, wanted independence like many other regions. This posed a problem for the Russian Federation, because it would cause a domino effect in which others would declare their independence as well. In an effort to prevent their separation from the Russian Federation, Yeltsin ordered Russian forces to invade Chechnya on December 11, 1994. He ordered a second invasion in 1999. Terrorist acts carried out by the Chechens were common, and the tensions in no way lessened following these two invasions. Yeltsin was known for often being under the influence of alcohol, which demonstrated his weakness as a leader and led to frequent relapses of authoritarian-style rule used during the Soviet Union. During this time, Russian society was just as messy as its president. Many followed Yeltsin's example and resorted to drinking, so alcoholism was rampant during his presidency. Also, oligarchs were able to easily take advantage of Yeltsin because he was wasted the majority of the time. Family members and advisors often granted themselves favors and invited economic and political corruption. Finally, because of illnesses and an alcohol addiction that left him extremely weak, Yeltsin resigned before the elections in 2000, allowing Vladimir Putin, the prime minister, to assume the position of an acting president.
As a child, Putin's life probably sucked. His two brothers died of disease, his grandmother was murdered, both his uncles disappeared and were never found, and his dad got severely wounded. But that was okay, because Putin made sure no one would ever kill him. He got a black belt in judo, and he graduated from St. Petersburg State University, where he was in a frat and majored in accounting. Just kidding. But it's believable, right? Anyways, after he graduated in 1975, he joined the Communist Party and became a high-ranking member of the KGB, a lieutenant colonel, until the coup d'etat against Gorbachev, when he decided that being alive was better than being communist. So he resigned. He then joined the, quote, democratic government, and he worked his way up through the offices, becoming appointed prime minister in 1999. Well, good news for homeboy Vlad, Yeltsin literally couldn't even, and so he resigned, and then Putin became president. He was such a good backup president that in 2000, he was elected as the actual president. During Putin's presidency, the economy was great. The GDP increased by 72%. Everyone loved Putin. So he was reelected in 2004. Then, in 2008, he realized he couldn't be president again. So he went back to his old job, the poor, measly prime minister. And then he was like, that's a nice constitution you got over there. Mind if I change it? So he hit up the Duma and said, hey guys, presidents can now be president for 6 years instead of 4. Okay, so just sign here, vote here, pass this. I love you guys. You guys are the best. So in 2012, you'll never guess what he did. You'll definitely guess what he did. He ran for presidency again, and he won. But people were not happy this time. They accused him of rigging the election. There were many protests, the most famous of which was a performance by the feminist rock band Pussy Riot. Over 8,000 people protested in Moscow in May of 2012. Still, Putin was not discouraged, and he issued presidential decrees which stated his goals to build the Russian economy and become even stronger. In 2013, Putin and the United Russia Party also passed stricter legislation against the LGBT community, banning gay propaganda. And in 2014, he was getting bored, so he sent his army to annex Crimea, formerly part of Ukraine. And even though the international community was not happy about this, Putin was like, hey guys, I'll make it up to you. I'm hosting a lit Olympics at my place in Sochi. Everyone's invited. So I guess that brought people closer together, and then the US forgave Putin. Psych, you thought? In 2016, Putin met Donald Trump, and they really hit it off. Trump was like, hey bro, please vote for me. And Putin was like, I am not American, but I will help. Well, friendship is great and all, so Donald Trump became president, and then when people were like, Vladdy, did you help your friend win the election? Putin was suddenly like, Donatello Trump, who? And America didn't like him anymore. So to describe Vladimir Putin in 4 words, it's easy. He is too legit to quit. That's right. He's back and better than ever in the 2018 election for a 4th term. And he's spicing it up by running as a strong, independent man who don't need no United Russia Party. How isn't he tired of this already?